They brought her in on a chain no thicker than a man's thumb, the iron looped through a collar at her throat and held at the other end by a guard who had not looked at her once since the gates of the lower city. She had stopped counting the days since the arrest. She had stopped counting. Most things. What remained of her attention she spent on the floor. The stone seams between the great hall's flagstones, the way the torchlight moved across them, the small and quantifiable fact of the cold rising through the thin soles of her shoes. These were real. These could be known. The crowd that had gathered on either side of the entrance colonnade to watch her be walked in, the laughter that broke in pockets as she passed, the single thrown piece of bread that struck her shoulder and fell. These she did not allow herself to feel. She had learned that trick 3 years ago, standing in the market square of Coldenmere, while Lord Voss read the charges against her father aloud to anyone who would listen. She had been 16. She had stood with her hands clasped and her eyes on the cobblestones, and she had taken herself somewhere behind her own ribs and waited for it to end. She was doing that now. The great hall of the Ashveld court was everything the lower city was not. Columns of pale granite rose 2 stories on either side, hung with tapestries in deep wine and black. Candles burned in iron chandeliers overhead, hundreds of them, casting the long room in a light that was almost warm if you did not look too closely. Long tables filled the central floor, crowded with lords and ladies in wool and embroidery, and at the far end, raised on a dais of black stone, 3 steps, above the rest, stood the throne. Wren did not look at it. She kept her eyes on the floor and let the guard lead her by the chain, and told herself it was no different from the livestock pens in the Coldenmere market, where she had once spent a winter helping a farrier's widow muck stalls in exchange for a corner to sleep in. She had done worse for less. The floor was cold. That was real. She breathed. She was not a remarkable thing to look at, in the way that courts counted remarkable. Her gown was rough-spun and days-worn. The collar bit into the pale skin above her collarbone. But there was something in the line of her face, the clean angle of her jaw, the high cheekbones catching the chandelier light, the dark copper of her hair twisted and pinned with a single wooden peg, that was not quite forgettable. Her eyes were the colour of deep amber, warm even in the cold hall light, and they moved across the floor with the focused economy of someone reading a map. She was slight, her bearing held with a stillness that read not as submission, but as extraordinary, deliberate restraint. The torchlight found the copper in her hair and held it. The herald's voice rang out above the crowd noise. His Grace Malachai, Alpha King of the Ashveld Reach, Lord Sovereign of the 6 territories, first of the blood-born line. The hall quieted. Not the polite quiet of ceremony, the absolute quiet of something instinctive, something older than manners. Wren felt it in her sternum before she understood it, a pressure change, a drop in the air, as if the room itself was orienting toward a single fixed point. She raised her eyes without meaning to. He was standing before the throne, not seated on it. That was the first thing. He was tall, taller than the guards, flanking him, taller than the herald, dressed in black wool and leather armor worn smooth at the shoulders, a wolf's head sigil at his chest in aged silver. His hair was dark and cut close. His jaw was a clean, hard line. There was a scar along the outer edge of his right hand, she saw, when he moved, a pale line running from the knuckle to the wrist, catching the candlelight for a moment, before his hand fell still again. He was looking at her. Not at the crowd, not at his court, at her. The herald continued. The prisoner is presented at the pleasure of Lord Voss of Coldenmere, who offers her as entertainment for the Midsummer court. A convicted thief and disruptor, brought to answer for her crimes, and to amuse his grace at his discretion. Laughter moved through the crowd. Someone made a comment Wren did not catch, and the laughter grew. The guard gave the chain a short, unnecessary jerk that nearly dropped her to her knees. She caught herself. She set her feet on the stone floor and breathed through her nose, and looked at the floor again, and she heard Lord Voss's voice from somewhere to her left, oiled and familiar, and exactly as she remembered it. She was caught stealing grain from my storehouse 3 times. A common criminal, your grace, but perhaps she can provide some sport. The hall was still watching. She could feel it like weather. Then Malachai spoke. His voice was low, and it carried anyway, the way a bell carries. Not loud, but reaching. Release the chain. A pause. The guard's hand went still. Your grace? Voss's voice had shifted slightly. Something uncertain in it. Release it, Malachai said. No additional words. No explanation. The guard released the chain. Wren caught it before it fell, her fingers closing around the iron out of pure reflex. And for a moment she was holding her own lead in her own hands, and the hall was silent around her, and she did not know what to do with that. She looked up. Malachai was still looking at her. His expression had not changed, no warmth in it, no readable feeling at all. But he had looked at her, specifically, and asked for the chain to be released, and those were the facts she had to work with. Lord Voss. Malachai's gaze moved at last, from Wren to the man at the left table. You have brought a woman to my court in a collar to amuse me. Your grace, it is customary during Midsummer to— I am aware of the custom. A pause. It will not occur again. The silence in the hall was a different quality now. Wren kept her eyes down and tried to make herself very small, inside her own body, and breathed. The prisoner will be taken to the east wing and given a room, Malachai said. Not a cell, a room. He looked back at the herald. Clear the hall. A ripple of disbelief moved through the assembled court. Wren heard it. The whispers, the shifting of bodies, the sound of chairs pushed back. Voss began to speak again, and Malachai's gaze returned to him with a stillness that stopped the words mid-syllable. The lords and ladies of the Ashveld court filed out through the side doors with the slow, bewildered movement of people who had expected a very different evening. The guard beside Wren looked at his colleague. Neither of them moved until the herald gestured sharply, and then they moved. She was taken to the east wing. The room they gave her had a bed with a wool blanket and a candle on the sill and a window with iron bars across it. But the bars were old, and the window faced a courtyard with a stone fountain that had frozen solid. And it was not a cage. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the chain in her lap and stared at the candle until it had burned down by 1/2 an inch. Then she looked at her hands. She had not taken anything from Voss's storehouse the 3rd time. She had taken it the first 2, but the 3rd charge, the one that had gotten her arrested, had been invented. She knew because she had been in Coldenmere's lower chapel that evening, cleaning in exchange for a night's shelter, and the sacristan had been with her the whole time. Voss knew that. The sacristan had tried to testify. Voss had had him reassigned to a monastery 40 miles north within the week. She folded the chain carefully and set it on the floor beside the bed, and she lay down without removing her shoes, and she was asleep before the candle burned down another 1/4 inch. She did not know what Malachai intended to do with her. She did not know what this place intended to do with her. But she had learned, in 3 years of having nothing, that you slept when you could, and you kept your eyes down, and you waited, because survival was a practice before it was a philosophy, and she had been practicing it long enough that it had become a kind of discipline. She slept. She would deal with tomorrow when tomorrow arrived. In the morning, a woman brought bread and a bowl of hot broth, set them on the small table by the window without speaking, and left. Wren ate every piece of bread and drank the broth to the bottom of the bowl and sat with the warmth of it in her chest like something almost safe. She was not summoned for 2 days. When the summons came, it was a single guard, no chain, who led her through corridors she had not seen, older than the great hall, the stone darker and worn smooth by longer use. The tapestries here faded to the colour of old moss. He brought her to a door at the end of a long passage and knocked twice and stood aside. Wren looked at the door and then at the guard. He was looking at the opposite wall. She pushed the door open. It was a library. That was the only word for it. Shelves of bound parchment volumes rising to the ceiling on 3 walls, a fireplace burning steadily in the 4th, and at a table in the centre of the room, Malachai, seated and reading. He did not look up when she entered. She stood in the doorway for a long moment and then stepped inside, because the alternative was standing in the doorway indefinitely, which seemed worse. He was not wearing armor today. Plain dark wool, sleeves pushed to the elbows. He looked younger without the wolf head sigil at his chest. Not young. He carried something in him that had never been young. A density of presence that was nothing as simple as age, but less formally terrible. His right hand rested on the table, the scarred edge visible. He read another line. Then he set the volume down and looked at her. "You are accused of 3 thefts," he said. "Lord Voss provided documentation." Wren said nothing. "I had the documentation reviewed." A pause. "The 3rd incident has no witness on Voss's side, and a named witness on yours, a sacristan who has since been removed from Coldenmere." His eyes were grey, she noticed. Not cold, simply clear, the way a blade is clear. All the ambiguity ground out of it. "The first 2 incidents you do not deny." "I took grain," she said. It was the first thing she had said aloud in days, and her voice came out rougher than she expected. From a storehouse that was half rotting. He was selling what wasn't rotting at triple price after the frost. There were children. Malachai was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sit down." She sat. The chair across the table from him was heavy oak, cushioned in worn leather, and it was the most furniture she had sat in for a year. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the table's surface. The grain of the wood, the ink stains at one corner, a small bronze paperweight in the shape of a wolf, with one ear worn smooth by repeated handling. "What is your name?" he said. Not a question. A request. "Wren. Just Wren. My father's name was Eld. Wren of Eld, if you need the full accounting." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. He said, "I knew of a man named Eld, a farrier's apprentice, out of the Reach's Eastern Territories. He became a landowner briefly, before the Coldenmere consolidation." She kept her face still. She had not heard her father spoken of, by anyone who did not use the word debtor or fool in the same breath for 3 years. "He died," she said. "When I was 15, the land went back to the lord who'd lent him the deed." "Lord Voss." "Lord Voss," she agreed. Malachai picked up the bronze wolf with his scarred hand and turned it once and set it back down. He looked at her. She looked at the paperweight. Outside the library window, she could hear wind moving through the bare courtyard trees, the low creak of branches in the cold. "You will remain in the East Wing," he said. "You are not a prisoner here. You are also not free to leave, until Lord Voss's claim against you has been formally answered, which will take some weeks. During that time, if you wish to be of use, there is work available in the household." She looked up. "What kind of work?" "Whatever you are capable of." He returned to his book. The audience, apparently, was over. She sat for another moment, watching him read, the firelight moving across the side of his face, the way he turned the page with the hand that was not scarred, slowly and without hurry. There were dark circles beneath his eyes that she had not noticed the night of the hall. He looked like a man who had not slept well in some time. She did not know why she noticed that. She stood, pushed the chair back carefully, and left. She took work in the household. The following morning, whatever required doing. She was not particular, and she was not proud. Or rather, she had learned to be neither. She helped in the kitchens before the morning meal, carried firewood from the yard to the upper corridors when the wood boy was down with a fever, mended linens in the east hall. The keep's other servants watched her with open curiosity for the first 3 days, and then with the subdued acceptance of people who had simply run out of time for curiosity. She was useful. That was enough of a credential. On the 4th day, one of the older women, Petra, who ran the East Wing, with the comprehensive authority of someone who had been doing so for decades, handed her a ring of keys and told her she would be responsible for the East Corridor candles each evening. Wren turned the keys over in her palm. They were iron, heavy, practical, exactly like every key she had ever seen. But she had not been trusted with keys since her father's house, and the weight of them in her hand opened something in her chest that she was not prepared for. She closed her fist around them before it showed in her face. She saw Malachai every few days, and it was never by arrangement. He moved through the keep the way water moves, by the most direct available path, and without announcing itself. She would be carrying logs up the back stair, and he would be descending it, and he would step aside and wait for her to pass, without being asked. She would be working in the library. He had given her access, in passing, without preamble, and he would come in to read. And sometimes he would speak, and sometimes he would not. And she learned that both were simply how he functioned, and neither meant anything in particular beyond itself. He ate alone most evenings. She knew because she walked past the great hall each evening to light the East Corridor candles, and it was almost always empty, a single setting, laid at the long table's end, that she had never seen occupied. The kitchens prepared food for it, regardless. She did not ask. He had a dog, not a wolf, a dog, an old, grey-muzzled hound that moved very slowly and slept most of the day on a stone bench outside the library door. Its name was apparently Anchor, though she had only heard it addressed once. It tolerated her proximity after the 2nd week. After the 3rd, it pressed its broad grey head against her hip when she sat near it. And she sat very still and let it, and thought of nothing at all. The cold in the keep was particular, not the brutal cold of the lower city, where wind came through every gap and you counted your warmth in single hours, but the deep, settled cold of old stone that had not been heated from within in a long time. The fires burned, the candles burned, but there was something in the walls themselves that the heat could not quite reach. She thought about that sometimes. A place that had been empty of the right kind of warmth, for long enough that the cold had moved into the structure itself. The first night she found the Alpha King standing alone, in the empty great hall. It was past midnight. She had come down to retrieve a ring of keys she had left on the hook inside the east door, and she stepped into the corridor and stopped. He was standing at the far end of the hall, with his back to her, looking at the far wall. Not at anything, on the wall. The wall was plain stone there. No tapestry, no sconce in that corner. He was just standing in the dark, at the edge of the last light from the dying fire. And he was completely still. And she understood, without reasoning her way to it, that this was a place he came to be alone, in a way that his chambers apparently did not allow. She retreated without making a sound, and got the keys, in the morning. She did not speak of it, but she thought about it. She thought about what Petra had told her on the 7th day, when they were folding linens together in the East Hall, and Wren had asked, carefully, how long the Alpha King had held this court. Petra had set down the sheet she was folding and looked at the window for a moment, and said, 12 years. He had been 23 when the blood-born inheritance transferred to him following the death of his elder brother in the Thornwall skirmish. The brother had been the expected heir. Malachai had been... Petra had paused here, choosing her word with the care of someone who had lived long enough to know which words mattered. Unexpected. He had not been prepared for the throne. He had not wanted it. He had taken it because there was no one else. That was 12 years ago. He had not named a consort. He had not held the selection that the blood-born code required. The lords of the 6 territories had been petitioning him about it for the last 4 years, which Petra said with the flat tone of a woman who had heard rather more about the lords of the 6 territories' opinions than she had ever wanted. Wren had folded the linen she was holding and set it on the pile and said nothing, and Petra had picked up the next sheet. And that had been the end of it. But she turned it over in the back of her mind, in the days that followed, like a stone turned to find what lived beneath it. A man who had inherited something he had not chosen and had been carrying it alone for 12 years. An empty place at the table that was set every night and never occupied. A great hall where the Alpha King stood in the dark, because the dark was the only privacy left in a life conducted entirely in public view. She understood that. She understood it in a way that surprised her, given that her life had been nothing but public exposure of a different and less chosen kind. Then Lord Voss arrived. He came with 8 retainers and a sealed letter from the Territory Council, and he came on the 14th day of her time in the East Wing. She knew he had arrived because she heard the horses in the courtyard from the east window and looked out and recognized the Voss livery. Black and river grey, a fish on the pennon, which had always struck her as an oddly small ambition for a man of his appetites. She stood at the window for a moment with the key ring in her hand and breathed through her nose, and then went to finish lighting the candles. Petra found her in the corridor 20 minutes later, with a look on her face that was professional, concern, disciplined into blankness. Lord Voss has requested that the prisoner be brought to the receiving hall, she said. Those are not his Grace's words, she added clearly. They are Lord Voss's. I'm not a prisoner, Wren said. She had said it because it was what Malachai had said, and because it was true, and because she needed to hear it said aloud in her own voice. She handed Petra the last 2 candles. Tell me where the receiving hall is. She walked there herself, without a guard, without a chain. She kept her hands loose at her sides and her chin level and walked through the keep's corridors with the same deliberate quietness she had used on the night she retrieved the keys, and she pushed open the receiving hall door and went in. Voss was, as she remembered him, broad through the shoulders, well-fed, his beard trimmed with the care of a man who had other people to look after the details of his appearance. He was 52 or 3, and he carried himself like a man who had not been told no in a long time. Malachai was seated in the receiving chair at the head of the room. 2 of the keep's own guards stood at the walls. Voss turned when she entered and crossed the room in 4 strides and gripped her arm above the elbow, hard enough that she felt the bones of his fingers through her sleeve, and steered her into the center of the room before Malachai could speak. It was the grip of a man who had done this before, who understood leverage, who had learned that physical fact precedes argument. She did not pull away. She stood in the center of the room and looked at Malachai, and her pulse was very loud in her ears, and her arm was beginning to ache, and she kept her chin level and her hands loose and waited. Here she is, Voss said, not to her, to Malachai, while his hand remained on her arm. Your Grace, you see what I've been managing. 3 years of this. A persistent problem. Malachai's gaze moved from Voss's hand to Voss's face. Something shifted in the grey clarity of his eyes. Not warmth, not anger, something older and more deliberate than either. He said, "Release her arm." Voss held for a moment. One moment, the moment of a man testing the weight of an authority he is not certain, yet he needs to respect. Then he released her. Wren did not move. She did not rub her arm. She stood where she was and breathed. "Lord Voss," Malachai said. His voice was the same as always. Low, reaching, the candlelight version of a bell. "I have reviewed the documentation you provided, and you'll see it's quite clear. The first two charges are substantiated. The third is not." A pause. "I will not be remanding her back to your custody." Voss was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the patience was still in his voice, but the warmth had gone out of it, like a candle snuffed between two fingers. "Your Grace, with respect, this falls under Caldenmere territorial jurisdiction, my jurisdiction. What happens within my own—" "Your own territory," Malachai said, "is where a sacristan was forcibly relocated within 72 hours of offering testimony. That is what falls under your jurisdiction." He did not raise his voice. He did not move. "You brought a woman to my court in a collar, Lord Voss. You called it entertainment. I called it something else." Wren looked at her hands. They were very still. She was making them be still. "She is a thief and a daughter of a debtor," Voss said. And now there was something tight in his voice, something that had always been there, beneath the warmth, and only came out when the warmth stopped working. "She is nothing. You are the Alpha King. You cannot mean to—" "I do mean to." Malachai stood. He was taller standing than he looked seated, and the firelight caught the silver wolf at his chest. "The claim against her is dissolved. The first two incidents will be assessed as necessity thefts, which are addressed under blood-borne law in Article 14. If you would like to dispute that assessment, you are welcome to bring the matter before the full Territory Council in the spring session." A pause. "I would advise against it." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Wren. The full attention, direct, for the first time since she had walked in. She met his eyes. She had practiced that too. "You've gotten above yourself," he said to her, quietly, for Voss. "That's what this is." "I got out of your reach," she said. "That's what this is." She had not planned to say it, but she had said it, and it was in the room now, and she did not take it back. Voss left the following morning. She heard the horses from the east window and watched the Voss livery pennon move out through the main gate and across the bridge and down the road, until it was too small to see. And then she let out a breath she had been holding since his arrival and turned back to the room. She was free to go. Malachai had told her so that afternoon, in the library, where she had found him in his usual chair. "The claim is dissolved," he said. "You are not bound here." He had been looking at the bronze wolf when he said it, not at her. He turned it once and set it down. "If you have somewhere to go." She had not answered immediately. She sat in the chair across from him. She had stopped being asked and had simply sat for the past week. And she looked at the fire for a moment. She had been asked, implicitly, if she had somewhere to go. The honest answer was no. The answer she could construct with some work was a possible maybe. She was good at constructing answers that were technically not lies. She had been doing it for 3 years. "The East Corridor candles," she said. "Petra hasn't assigned those to anyone else." Malachai was quiet. He was looking at the book open on the table before him, not reading it, the way he sometimes looked at things, to give his face somewhere to go. Then, "No, she hasn't." "Then I'll stay until she does." He did not respond to that. But he picked up the book and actually read it, which she had learned was his version of allowing something. That night she ate in the kitchens with Petra and 2 of the younger maids, and an old man named Cause, who had tended the Ashveld horses for 30 years and who ate in comfortable silence and asked nothing of anyone. The bread was fresh, the fire was banked high. Anka pressed his grey head against her knee under the table, and she fed him the end of her bread without thinking about it. And the kitchen was full of the smell of wood smoke and rosemary and the low sound of people who had simply eaten together long enough that they didn't need to perform it anymore. She stayed. 3 weeks became 4. 4 became 6. She did not count them. She did the candles and helped Petra and read in the library, because Malachai had given her access, and she had learned to use it. Her way to a shelf in the far left corner where the older texts were kept. Natural philosophy, histories of the blood-born, an account of the mate recognition, instinct written by someone who had clearly experienced it, and was trying very hard to describe something for which they had no adequate language. She read that one twice. The mate recognition instinct. The blood-born texts were careful about it. Not myth, not magic, a biological truth of the alpha lineage, a knowing that was physiological before it was emotional, a certainty that settled in the chest before the mind had finished reasoning. The text said it could be suppressed, that it had been suppressed deliberately by blood-born kings who had political arrangements that precluded its expression. They said suppression was costly. They did not say costly how. She set the book back on its shelf carefully, spine aligned. She was in the east corridor 2 evenings later, lighting the candles in order, as she always did when she felt it for the first time. A pressure behind her sternum, a sudden acute awareness of the space behind her, the way you knew, without turning, that a door had opened. She turned. The corridor was empty. The torches burned. The stone seams ran their familiar lines along the floor. Nothing was there, but the feeling did not leave immediately. It faded the way warmth fades from a hearthstone after the fire has been banked, slowly, reluctantly, as if it had somewhere it preferred to be. She lit the last candle and stood for a moment in the corridor and breathed. Then she went back to work. She did not go to Malachai with it. She went to the text instead because she had learned to read before she had learned to trust, and the texts were not going to look at her with grey eyes that she had spent 6 weeks learning to read and tell her something that would change the shape of the room she was standing in. She needed to understand the mechanism before she could trust what it was telling her. She understood it on the night of the first frost. She was crossing the inner courtyard when she heard it. Not a sound, a change in sound, the stop of something that had been moving. She turned, and Malachai was standing at the far end of the courtyard beneath the frozen fountain, his breath clouding in the cold air, looking at her. He was still. She was still. The courtyard between them was lit by a moon that had come out from behind the cloud cover, and the frost on the stones caught the light and held it, and she felt the pressure behind her sternum again, not sudden this time, but steady and certain, like a compass needle that had found its north and stopped spinning. She had been reading about it for weeks. She knew its name. She knew from the texts that it moved in one direction first before it moved in both, and she knew from the way he was standing. The absolute stillness of him. The fact that he had stopped moving and had not resumed. That it had already moved in his. She stood in the moonlit frost, with her dark copper hair coming loose from its pin and her amber eyes on his face, and she thought of the woman who had been walked into this hall in a chain and told herself that woman had stood with her hands clasped and survived it. She could stand here too. She crossed the courtyard, not quickly. She walked the way she always walked, deliberately, with her chin level and her hands loose, and stopped a few feet from him, and looked at his face, and he looked at hers, and neither of them said anything for long enough that the moon moved a small fraction across the sky. Then she said, "You knew." He did not pretend. not to understand her. "Before the hall," he said, "when they brought you in." She breathed. She thought about standing in the great hall with the chain in her hands, and every lord and lady of the Ashveld court laughing, and this man standing before the throne looking at her with an expression she had read as unreadable, and the chain falling from the guard's hand. "You didn't say anything," she said. "You had just been brought to my court, in a collar," he said, very quietly, "to amuse me. What would you have had me say?" She had no answer for that. She stood in the frost-lit courtyard and looked at him and felt the pressure behind her sternum expand into something that was not quite warmth and not quite pain and was, she thought, what the texts had been trying to describe and kept failing. The physical evidence preceding the explanation, the feeling before the name for it existed. "The selection," she said. "The council has been asking for 4 years. Yes. The blood-born law, a mate, a queen. Yes," he said again. He was looking at her with those grey, unambiguous eyes, and something in them that she had been reading as emptiness for 6 weeks, and was now understanding, with the specific vertigo of a misread word corrected, as patience. He had been waiting, not for her, specifically. He had not known she existed, but in the way that you wait when you know something is owed to you, and you have not been paid, and you have decided you will not accept a substitute. She thought about the empty place at the table set every evening, the great hall where he stood, in the dark, because the dark was the only privacy left. Anka's grey head against her hip. The library with its fire always burning, for a man who read alone. "So I'm the daughter of a landless debtor," she said. "I am in this keep because I was brought here in a chain." "I know what you are," he said. And there was something in his voice that she had not heard there before. Not warmth exactly. Something older than warmth. Something worn smooth by long use. Like the bronze wolf's ear under repeated hands. "I have known since the night of the hall. It is not a thing I require your permission to know." She looked at him for a long moment. The frost held the moonlight. The fountain stood silent and frozen behind him, and she thought that in spring the water would move again. And she did not know why that thought arrived in this particular moment, except that things that had been held in suspension sometimes only needed the right season. She had been careful for 3 years. She had been practical and quiet, and she had kept her eyes on the floor, and she had taken only what she needed, and asked for nothing, and expected nothing, and she had survived. She had become very good at surviving. She was looking now at the man who had released her chain without being asked and dissolved Lord Voss's claim, and said, "You are not a prisoner here," and meant it. And she was standing in a frost-lit courtyard at midnight, with the mate recognition instinct settled in her chest, like a compass that had finally stopped spinning, and she was trying to figure out if she was brave enough to be something other than a survivor. She decided she was. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Neither do I," he said. Honestly, plainly, without apology. "I have been doing most things alone for 12 years. I am not certain I remember how to do them otherwise." "Then we'll make mistakes," she said. "Yes," he said. "We will." She took a step toward him. He did not step back. He stood with his hands at his sides and his breath clouding in the cold air, and she stopped an arm's length from him and looked up at his face and thought, "This is the shape of something beginning, not the shape of something perfect or easy or assured. The shape of something chosen by 2 people who had each learned, in their different and difficult ways, what it cost to go without." She reached up and took his scarred right hand in both of hers, carefully, the way she held the keyring, with attention to the weight of it. He looked at her hands around his. "The candles," she said. "I still need to finish the east corridor." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile. and was more than one. "I know," he said. She let go of his hand. She went back to the corridor and finished the candles. Every one of them, in order, the way she always did. When she came back through the courtyard, the moon was higher and the frost was deeper, and Malachai was gone. Returned to wherever the Alpha King went at midnight. But Anchor was there, his grey muzzle lifted toward her, tail moving once. She sat beside him on the frozen stones and put her hand on his broad grey head and sat for a while in the quiet. In the spring, when the Territory Council arrived for the formal selection hearing, they found Malachai already decided. He presented Wren not as a candidate, but as the candidate. Wren of Eld, daughter of the Eastern Reach, currently the keeper of the East Corridor keys. The council had prepared 14 formal objections, which she later read, and found moderately interesting. Malachai had prepared one response, which addressed all 14 simultaneously, and which she also read, and which was, she had to acknowledge, complete. Voss sent a letter to the council in protest. The council, presented with the Alpha King's formal declaration and the evidence of Article 14, applied correctly, declined to act on it. She read that letter too. She set it down on the library table and pushed it to one side and went back to the text she had been reading, which was a natural history of the Eastern Reach territories, and which she found considerably more interesting than anything Lord Voss had to say. Malachai came in an hour later. He saw the letter pushed to the side of the table. He looked at it, and then at her. She did not look up from her book. "The Voss matter," she said. "Resolved," he said. "I know," she said. "I read the council's response." He sat down across from her. He picked up the bronze wolf and turned it once in his scarred hand and set it down. She turned her page. Anchor settled against the wall by the fire. Outside, the courtyard fountain had come alive again. She could hear it faintly, the water moving through the stone channels, finding its way. She did not know what she was becoming exactly, but she was becoming it here, in a library that smelled of old parchment and wood smoke, across a table from a man who had waited 12 years for something real, and who was now apparently reading over her shoulder. She turned the book so he could see it better. He said nothing, but he stayed.